Well, it's a long day to finish off. Kate and I are husband and wife, which means we feel free to interrupt each other. What we're going to do is try and show you that inequality, the amount of inequality, primarily income inequality in a society, is an important determinant of health, well-being, sustainability, health including mental health, actually. We're going to take you through that data. I'm going to start and Kate is going to take over. But one thing I wanted to say before that, I've been a member of an EU foresight group looking at possibilities of social conflict. And I've been thinking a lot about the future and worrying about how difficult it might be. And worrying that actually to talk about increased well-being may be wishful thinking. That given that carbon emissions are likely to rise, I suspect many of us believe by 2 or 3 degrees. And if you look at Tim Lenton's recent paper in Nature Sustainability, it talks about several billion people out of their comfort zone, where people can live healthily, agriculture still works, and so on. That 2 or 3 degrees would destroy that kind of environment for 2 or 3 billion people. And that means huge flows, increased numbers of refugees, migrants, and so on. And if you think the problems that the small numbers in the past have generated, how it sucked the life out of politics in our societies, led to the rise of the far right, often denying climate change. You can see some of the problems. But as well as that, all the problems of extreme climate events and so on, the likelihood of not just the pandemic we've had, but many more, affecting not only human populations, but animal populations and crops and so on. The likelihood of water shortages, food shortages. We're in for a very bumpy ride. And I think we have to wonder whether it's right to think of increased well-being in the future. But actually, from our point of view, greater equality allows a society to ride out these adverse things that are going to throw us around, makes a society more cooperative, more mutually supportive, more adaptable. And so whether I'm right in this rather pessimistic view, or whether indeed we can think about the rise in well-being we've been talking about, I think equality is at the center of it. So let me take you through some of that data. First, because I'm going to talk about inequality, I think it's important to point out that people's view of inequality is really, I think, a serious misunderstanding. People think of it in material terms, that it only matters if it creates terrible poverty in the rest of society. But actually, I want you to think about inequality as a social relationship between us. Some people made superior, others inferior. Isaac's talk first in this session online, he talked about people mattering and fairness. And in a sense, what we're doing is talking about that in a different language. We talk about whether people are valued or not. So it changes social relationships in a society, makes people believe they're superior at the top, and other people feel they're regarded as inferior. And I think that has a lot to do with the mental health problems that have been mentioned by the young people speaking now, and I'll go on to say something about. When people think of a social hierarchy, again, they always think simply in material terms. The material is important of where it places you. We take possessions and wealth as a measure of status, of importance. and people at the top think of them as better than themselves as better than the rest of them, as the rest of us. I want to quote from a study which interviewed poor people in different societies, in rich and poor societies, about the experience of poverty. So they were asking, what does it feel like to be poor? And they interviewed people in Uganda, in India, in China, Pakistan, Korea, the United Kingdom, and Norway. And of course, poverty means totally different things in those societies. In some societies, it means more like the picture on the right. And on others, in Norway, for instance, you can be poor, classified as poor, and live in a 3-bedroom flat with most of the modern electronics and so on. And yet, the experience of poverty was very similar. And I'm going to read this to show you the importance of the psychosocial things to do with social status. The study said respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officials. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed acceptance. So when you think about social status, don't just think about whether people have things they need to live conveniently. Think about what it feels like to be looked down on, and how we all have those insecurities about how others see and judge us. You know, we're all inferior in terms of the people in the rung above us in society. I wish the comedians were still here, because this graph they might feel was simple enough. I found it on Google Images, and it summarizes about 45 years of my work. So there's a lifelong research program for you. And what I'm going to do is show you a number of graphs like this before coming on to explaining the social or psychological processes going on behind the data. But basically, in all of them, bigger income differences will be on the right, and different problems up the vertical axis. First, you might regard this as a measure of well-being. It's an index for rich developed countries where you can get good comparable data on all those things listed there. Life expectancy, kids' maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide, imprisonment. That's the proportion of the population in prison. Teenage birth rates, trust, obesity, mental illness, which includes drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility. Where a country is its sort of average position in relation to all those different outcomes, which are simply downloaded from WHO, OECD, and so on, all weighted equally. And bad scores are scored high on this. So USA, Portugal, USA, UK are all doing very badly. The Scandinavian countries and Japan doing well. And if they do well on one of those things, they tend to do well on all of them, or badly on one and badly on all of them. We were worried that people might think that this wasn't just the obvious internationally comparable data which we could compare these countries, but they'd think we'd chosen things to suit our arguments. So we also looked at the UNICEF index of child well-being in rich countries. So this is actually a very important, probably the most important measure of child well-being that has been produced. It contains whether children can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying at school, how they do in these international maths and literacy tests, whether there's immunization, what their health are like, whether they're likely to get involved in drugs and so on. And in this one, the scoring is the opposite way around, I'm sorry. So bad results are low scores. That's why it slopes down rather than up. But look what a powerful determinant income inequality is of both that last measure of well-being and this one. You cannot ignore it. It's absolutely central to everything we're talking about. And actually, there have been a number of papers now, 8 or maybe even 10, looking at the COVID epidemic, showing that it was worse in the more unequal countries. There are lots of other papers that show, in a way, the psychosocial effects of inequality in a society. This one, a recent one on what they call civic honesty. It's simply looking to see whether, those experiments where wallets are left around as if they're lost, looking to see how many returned in different societies. And in more equal societies, at the top there, it's about 80% of them are found and returned. In the more unequal societies, it's only about 20%. The scale of these differences is fairly typical of what we found in outcomes, both in this group of countries and looking at the 50 states of the USA. We did the analysis in both places, and the results are almost identical. I want to take you now through what I think is one of the most important processes showing the effects of inequality on the relationships between us, on social relations in society. This is a measure of people's involvement in community life, in voluntary organizations, choirs, gardening groups, different local groupings. There might be voluntary work, that kind of thing. And you see that measure that they call civic participation is much higher in more equal countries. There are also measures of trust. There are lots of papers showing that civic community life and so on is stronger in more equal countries. There are lots of papers showing people trust each other more in more equal countries. And you can see that, again, the differences are pretty large. In the more unequal, it's perhaps only 15–20% of people who feel they agree that most people can be trusted. In more equal societies, it rises to 60 or 70%. Again, huge differences. And this isn't just an abstract thing. If you've got to walk home alone in one of our big cities, you will feel much safer doing it in a more equal society. You won't have that worry about who else is on the street around you and whether someone's following you or whatever, particularly important for women. There are also a lot of papers, I should think about 60 now, showing that violence is more common in more unequal societies. It's very well established. And the reason seems, this is homicide rates. It's American states, the red dots, and the Canadian provinces are the blue triangles at the bottom left, more equal. And it's looking at homicides per million people. And it goes from 15 or 20 homicides per million up to 150. These huge differences. And the reason for that seems to be that in a more unequal society, status and class, social position matters more, and people get more worried about how they're seen and judged, of being disrespected, looked down on, issues of loss of face and so on, that trigger violence. It just triggers violence so much more easily. People are more likely to feel that you're disrespecting them. Why are you looking at them in that funny way? Those sorts of things. If you go to even more unequal countries than in our data, as Kate and I have to give lectures, this is Mexico, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And it's gone a whole stage further there. You see, people are frightened of each other. They're barricading their houses with razor wire around the fences and bars on the windows and doors. And in South Africa, exactly the same thing, where there are huge inequalities for different reasons. In both places, people think you shouldn't go out at night. So when we visited, they found it very difficult to take us out for a meal in the evening. They're really worried about that. And actually, the picture I've given is confirmed by work from an American economist, again repeated on the American states and this group of countries internationally, which looks at the proportion of the labor force involved in what they call guard labor: security staff, police, prison officers, all the people we use to protect each other from ourselves from each other. And of course, as trust declines, violence increases, we want more people in those sorts of roles in our society. So it confirms exactly the analysis I've just given you in the earlier few slides. And I think really what we're dealing with is particularly tragic, because, as several speakers have said, the real determinants of happiness and well-being are the quality of social relationships, community life, family life, number of friends you've got. And these are found in lots of studies to be powerfully predictive, not only of happiness, but also of health. You know, whether or not you smoke is slightly less important to your survival than whether or not you have friends. Friendship is a really powerful determinant of health. And so what inequality is doing is winkling away, destroying the most important, the most serious sources of our well-being. I think what we're talking about is whether we have societies with very steep social pyramids like that, or much shallower ones like that. And you can see how in the steeper class societies, with the bigger income differences, people are less likely to marry someone from a different class. The social barriers are bigger. The whole society becomes more ossified. There are lots of indications of how divisive it is. And of course, in a society with smaller income differences, social relations change. The hierarchy isn't so hierarchical. If you like, the scale of material differences between us give rise to the social distances between us, those feelings of superiority and inferiority. And we've been able to see how all these things feed into poor mental health through, and I thought I'd got the slide here. I don't know what can have happened to it. Yes, it is there. I thought this slide came later. This slide is showing you how it's not just a sort of theoretical idea that status and class become more important, that if you do surveys asking people about their reported status anxiety, how worried they are about how people see and judge them, you find that across all income groups, people become more worried about status and others' judgments of you, more worried about what people think of you in more unequal societies. In a way, those bigger class differences, those bigger status and income differences make us all believe that some people are worth much more than others, and so we all worry more about how we are seen and judged. So that top line is the high levels of status anxiety across all income groups, from the poorest tenth of the population to the richest tenth. The bottom line, in more equal countries, are much lower levels of those anxieties. And actually, we know these kinds of anxieties are amongst the most powerful for raising cortisol levels, biological stress hormones, which do the damage, which have effects that look rather like more rapid aging, lead to earlier death and more illness. This is a study where they looked at, I think, over 200 studies where people are given stressful things to do, and they measure the cortisol response in saliva or blood samples. And they find that what really pushes up your cortisol levels is tasks that involve what they call social evaluative threat. Your worries about how you're seen and judged, threats to self-esteem and social status, situations like public speaking where you can be judged negatively. You know, we're extraordinarily sensitive to that. And now we know how that feeds into mental illness. An important study by Sherry Johnson at Berkeley and colleagues looked at what they call the dominance behavioral system, area of our brain, systems in our brain for dealing with social status issues. Think of this as a sensitivity that perhaps we acquired in our pre-human past. If you think of monkeys in dominance hierarchies, they have to know they're inferior to the dominants. They have to know where they come, where others come, learn to keep out of the way of more powerful animals. And she showed that a wide range of personality disorders and mental illnesses are triggered or exacerbated by issues to do with hierarchy. I think when she wrote that paper, she thought all societies had a very similar kind of social pyramid. I got in touch with her when I read the paper, and I said, I think these problems are worse in more unequal societies, where the social pyramid is more powerful. And we've actually found a number of papers showing that some of the mental illnesses she was talking about indeed are more common in those more unequal societies. We had done a paper a long time ago looking at mental illness in relation to inequality using some WHO measures, but there's been a much better paper more recently in the British Medical Journal, Open. What you've got here is along the bottom you've got correlation coefficients between the level of inequality in each of the countries of the OECD, the 36 countries, and levels of different mental disorders and mental illnesses and personality disorders. So those long blue lines show a strong correlation between the amount of inequality in different societies and the levels of mental illness. Our impression is there are two ways of responding to these worries about how you're seen and judged, exacerbated by greater inequality. One is to go under, to feel you're no good, you're looked down on, you're inadequate, to sort of accept this low opinion of yourself, that you're devalued, that you're not good enough in all sorts of ways. And so you're hesitant to go to social events, meet other people, go to parties and so on. You withdraw from social life because it's too stressful. And indeed, we know that now about 3 papers showing depression is more common in more unequal societies. But there's another response to those same worries about status. And that is, as Isaac again mentioned in the earlier talk in this session, narcissism. You big yourself up. You try and show in conversations how successful you were, how brilliant you are, that you went to such a good university, that you're rich enough to have family holidays the other side of the world and all that kind of thing. And that too is confirmed by studies of what's been called self-enhancement, where people, in this graph, they were interviewed in different countries and asked, how you think you compare with others in your society? Do you think you're cleverer than other people in Iceland? Do I think I'm more interesting or more, I don't know, more this, that, a better driver than other people in Britain? You probably know the joke that 96% of Americans think they're better drivers than the average. And so there's this process closely related to narcissism, self-aggrandizement, bigging yourself up, saying you're better than you are. I'm now going to hand over to Kate, who's going to show you how it relates to sustainability.
I'm going to sit you there.
Yes.
Right.